Tune in to UFO Undercover, Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, with your host, Joe Montaldo, right here on the Paranormal Radio Network.
And welcome to this episode of the Gateway Podcast. I'm your host, C.L. Thomas. How is everybody out there tonight? So we are broadcasting live from the edge of the Mojave where the strange slips through the cracks. And we are live on United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM New Orleans. Tonight we're joined by Bill Kousoulas. He's a phenomenal, I can never say the word, guys. Phenomenology, I can never ever say this word, research professional and co-author of Bridging the Tragedy. And the tragedy we're talking about is from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with the Mothman. So later this month, I think it comes up on September 27th, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look real quick before I lie to you guys. When is that festival? I'm on their website and September 21st and 22nd, Mount Pleasant. It's Point Pleasant. There's a Mount Pleasant in Pittsburgh where I grew up, and that's why I keep saying that. But Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the annual Mothman Festival is happening. And so I thought it would be really good to have somebody who is an author, Bridging the Tragedy, come on and talk a little bit about it and help us get ready for this big festival. They have it every year. But before we get into that, you've been listening to Into the Night with Sean Kelly and a special guest, Don Yazzie. He's known for his work on the channel from Don't Whistle at Night. I'm not sure where he gets that title, but it's so interesting because he is part of the Navajo community around the Four Points area. And if you've ever heard of a death whistle, has anyone ever heard about that, the death whistle? So a couple friends of mine and I went out into the desert one night and we're playing around with those Aztec death whistles. And apparently you can call in skinwalkers and Bigfoots, and we called in something all right. I don't know if it was paranormal. I can't really go into details because we were filming for a project, but we did call in something pretty interesting. And it wasn't Bigfoot, and I don't even think it was a skinwalker, but it was pretty interesting. It's currently 97 degrees here in the Mojave, but around where I'm at, up in the highlands, it's around 92. This morning I got up around 5 a.m. It was still dark out, and I took my dog out. Guys, there's already a chill in the air. So the seasons are definitely changing. Is it happening where everybody else is? I feel like it's a little early this year, right? Printed copies of Eerie Expeditions magazine are available. They're on sale. They're only $11 for the hard copy. Those will be mailed out on September 18th when they come back from the print house. So you can grab a copy at eerieexpeditionsmagazine.com. If you want a copy, if you want to reserve a copy, don't wait, because there's only so many copies and nearly all of them are already sold and accounted for. So don't wait. If you want a copy, go ahead and sign up. It looks like it's $14.99 on the website, but once you hit checkout, I can't talk tonight. Once you hit the checkout, it's $11 plus tax or plus shipping. So let's get into our topic tonight. We're joined by Dr. Bill Kousoulas. He's a Phenomenology Research Professional and co-author of Bridging the Tragedy. His research explores the fascinating connections between psychology, spirituality, and paranormal, with a focus on how people experience growth after trauma. That point is particularly interesting to me. He's inspired by Mothman Prophecies, and he's dedicated so much of his career to understanding the human side of this unexplained phenomenon in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. His wife, Jackie, is a co-author, but she's sick tonight, so she will not be joining us. Hi, Dr. Kousoulas. Welcome to the show.
Hi, CL. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on tonight.
So how should I address you as Dr. Kousoulas? Is that how I say it?
You can call me Bill.
Call you Bill. Okay.
You can call me Bill. Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
So tell me a little bit about your book and about your work and why you decided to write about Point Pleasant. I keep saying Mount Pleasant.
I understand. So I saw the Mothman Prophecies movie way back in 2003. So it's been over 20 years now. And it really was fascinating to me. And so I went out and I bought the book by John Keel about the Mothman Prophecies, and really kind of went off the deep end and studied everything I could about the whole Mothman story, about the phenomenon. John Keel, the author, as well as his contemporary, Gray Barker, I gathered all their information and just read and studied and so on and so forth, and did that for over 10 years. And in 2016, my wife, Jackie, asked me where I would like to go for vacation. And I said, well, let's go to Point Pleasant. So she kind of looked at me and she said, okay, we can do that as long as you take me to the Serpent Mound also. They're not too far away from each other. So we did that. We drove to the Serpent Mound over the 4th of July weekend. We spent the night. We checked out the Serpent Mound, but the whole time I was just getting twitchy. I wanted to get to Point Pleasant. So we took off the next day and we headed towards Point Pleasant. And it was just a really magical experience for me. I mean, when we got to the actual Silver Memorial Bridge, the bridge that goes over the Ohio River, which replaced the Silver Bridge, which had collapsed back in 1967, I just had this glow about me. I was so excited that the sky reminded me of the Tom Cruise movie, Vanilla Sky. It just was surreal. The whole thing was just a really, really fascinating experience. And we rolled into town, and I want to say that was on a Friday. I don't remember the day of the week it was, but we arrived in Point Pleasant, which is a very small little town, after 5 o'clock, and everything was closed. We saw the Mothman statue, we saw the museum, and then we saw the post office. And my wife is a retired postmaster, so of course she kind of zoned in on that. She was still working, for the Postal Service then. But basically, we ran out of things to do because it's a small town and we didn't know what else to do with ourselves. So Jackie noticed that there was a little old lady looking out of the restaurant window right across the street from the Mothman Museum. And she said, I think that lady wants us to come talk to her. And I was ready to get out and go explore. And I said, you know what, let's go down here and let's see what's over here. And she looked at me again and she stopped me. And she said, no. She wants to talk to us. We need to go talk to her. So if my wife tells me twice what we need to do, I typically listen because she usually knows what she's talking about. So we entered this little restaurant. We walked in and we met this lady. Her name was Carolyn Harris. She's really sweet Southern lady, early to mid 70s, invited us in, poured us a couple drinks, a couple Cokes or whatever it was we had. And there was another gentleman that was in the restaurant also, and his name was Mark. And we just got to visiting with them. And I don't know, 10, 15 minutes into the conversation, I said, you look familiar to me. Have I seen you maybe in a documentary? And she said, yeah, you probably have. I said, "You've been in a documentary?" She said, "Well, I've been in about 16 of them."
Oh,
So
wow.
she was the co-founder of the Mothman Festival, very, very ingrained within the community. And most importantly, in 1967, when the Silver Bridge collapsed, she lost her first husband and her 2-year-old son in the bridge disaster.
Oh,
So
wow.
as soon as we heard that, it kind of puts you in a position of reverence, and you want to take good care of this lady and just have a really positive relationship with her. So for the next several days, we kept going back to the restaurant, and she told us about what it was like when Mothman was in town, and there were UFOs that were taking place in Point Pleasant at that time, also back in '66 and '67. She talked about the men in black. What she would not talk about was the bridge disaster because it was just too painful for her. And we understood that and we respected that. So after our trip, which I really thought was going to be a one and done kind of a thing, we had a wonderful time. We checked out the Chief Cornstalk hunting grounds. We went out to the TNT area where Mothman was sighted by Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette back in '66. And we just got really kind of connected to the community. But we went back home after our trip. And at that point, we had to go back into our day jobs, doing the things that we did to allow us to be able to take vacations. So the next several months went by, and on Christmas Eve, I told Jackie we were headed to her mom's house for Christmas dinner. And I said, we should give Carolyn a call because she'd given us her phone numbers and we just really connected with her. We love this lady. And Jackie said, that's a good idea, but it's Christmas Eve. Let's call her after the holidays are over. And so I agreed. Let's do that. The very next day, Mark, the gentleman we met in the restaurant with Carolyn, on Christmas Day, sent us a message on Facebook Messenger and told us that Carolyn had had a heart attack, and the next day she died. So sadly, we never had a chance to go back to Point Pleasant and to see her again. But long story short, we had gotten to be friendly with Jeff Wamsley, who owns the Mothman Museum, during our first visit. And I contacted him, and the next year we ended up going to dinner with him when I was coming back from a residency when I was working on my doctorate. And we sat down and visited with him and so on and so forth. And we started kind of putting together the blueprint, or at least the mental idea, for a book we'd like to write about Point Pleasant. But when I finished graduate school in 2021, right after that, we built a research plan. And the research plan was to look at the good things that became of the community of Point Pleasant by experiencing the Silver Bridge disaster and experiencing the paranormal phenomena, meaning Mothman, UFOs, men in black, et cetera, et cetera. So it was our passion for the people and really that brief time we got to know Carolyn that kicked off our desire to write this book and ultimately write Bridging the Tragedy.
Wow, that's quite the story. How ironic was it that you thought about her like that and then she passed away in that same time frame?
I would go on record to say that it was really bizarre, except things like this happen in our lives all the time. I mean, they just really seem to manifest. And I know the term synchronicity is bandied around quite a bit these days, but we really do find it, especially when we're looking at, the paranormal community and specifically Mothman. So, we found, I wasn't shocked that it happened when it did. I was saddened, but these are the kinds of things that we almost kind of look for to happen in our lives now. Not necessarily, certainly somebody's death, but weird coincidences happen in our lives all the time.
This is one thing that people never seem to bring up, and this is the first time I even really thought about it, to be honest with you. The whole Silver Bridge collapse was that not that long ago. And so we have this Mothman festival every single year in Point Pleasant. I feel like we don't really talk about the survivors that had loved ones that had died in that tragedy. So
And I would agree with you. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
interesting.
When I worked on my doctorate, I studied the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth. It's the good things that we get to experience as a result of going through things that basically shatter our worldviews. And traditionally, post-traumatic growth, which has been a phenomenon that's been studied by psychologists for the last 30 years or so. Traditionally, it's been studied in things like cataclysmic disasters, talking about things like earthquakes, the tsunami that happened in 2004, mass catastrophe, people losing their lives in mass quantities. And so it made sense to us to take a look at the Silver Bridge disaster because there were 46 people who died in a town of about 4,000. So that's a pretty significant portion of the community. And after having gotten to know Carolyn, I really wanted to work on a book about her life specifically. But again, we only knew her for a week, less than a week. We never got to see her again. So what better way to commemorate that brief relationship than to study with other survivors who had lost loved ones, family members, friends, to get to know what their lives turned out to be like. And it was really something that I don't know, in my life, it's one of the most important things that I've been able to work on. And I'm very passionate about that.
For those unfamiliar, could you share what inspired you? Well, you already shared a little bit about writing Bridging the Tragedy, but how did the Silver Bridge collapse become, so to speak, the central focus for your research?
So the Silver Bridge was constructed in 1928, and that being almost 100 years ago now, it was kind of built with horse and buggy and Model T Fords in mind. It wasn't built with 18-wheel semis and big, heavy cars. This is a 2-lane bridge. It was a bridge that was put together with what was really newfangled technology back then. It was only utilized a few times. It was built by a format that's called I-bar construction. So it's not really a suspension bridge like you'd see the Golden Gate Bridge or other suspension bridges throughout the world, but it's a series of interlocking eye-bolts that basically come together like so, and then they form this entire structure that supports the bridges. I think one of them was in South America, 2 of them were in West Virginia, and those are the only 3 that I'm aware of. But this bridge was, again, built with much lighter load capacity in mind. And in 1967, it had been standing for 39 years. It was really a very well-known landmark between Ohio and West Virginia. But there was a small fracture that was inside one of the encasements where the I-bars came together. It was a manufacturing defect, and it was very, very small, just a centimeter or so, a crack. And over the years, almost 40 years, with the elements and the heavier vehicles and such, on December 15th of 1967, the bridge packed with all kinds of cars and semis and such, and both lights were turned red. And I guess this was a phenomenon that took place on a pretty regular basis in the Silver Bridge, but it was totally packed. And it was very cold. It was very, very humid. And this crack finally gave way. And they said that it tilted the deck of the bridge to one direction and half the cars fell into the river. And then it twisted and turned the other direction and the other half of the cars fell into the river. And then the whole encasement fell down on top of the vehicles below. So there were very few survivors. 46 people died. 2 bodies were never recovered. A lady and then a young school girl were never recovered. But I think the reason this is my theory about this, the Mothman and the UFOs and all the strange phenomena that was going on was one thing. And it was really kind of a singular case where nothing of this concentration of paranormal activity, really outside of something like Skinwalker Ranch, has ever taken place in a community, certainly a small community like Point Pleasant. But when the Silver Bridge went down at the end of all that activity, a lot of people have kind of combined the Mothman legend with the Silver Bridge disaster. They go together like hand in glove, but the people in Point Pleasant who lost loved ones don't want to hear about the Mothman in conjunction with the bridge. They believe it was 2 separate things. In fact, a lot of the people that we interviewed for Bridging the Tragedy said, we can talk about Mothman, but don't bring that crazy thing into the Silver Bridge disaster because we lost friends. we lost family members. So I think to answer your question, the Silver Bridge was such a pronounced catastrophe in such a small town that happened after 13 months of paranormal activity, which really didn't necessarily 100% subside at the end of that time, but it really went away because the people's focus was now on salvage, the relationships, helping support people in the community who had lost loved ones. And as Jeff Wamsley, when we interviewed him for the book, said, don't talk to us about that crazy stuff. We're burying loved ones now.
Oh, wow. Well, where does this idea of, where does the Mothman legend, it is tied to Point Pleasant, but I kind of understand like it's a separate thing from the narrative of the tragedy and the trauma. But do you think that the Mothman and all of that phenomena was kind of like a precursor, or maybe a, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a warning or something that this was going to occur?
In my years of studying the story and the people that we've talked to, both researchers on the paranormal side and really just on the human side, for the most part, really kind of what I've come to think about the situation is that if Mothman were related to the bridge disaster, I don't believe that it caused the bridge disaster. If it were related, then my thought would be, as you mentioned, it warned the people of the community that something catastrophic was going to happen. Now, John Keel, the researcher who was boots on the ground in Point Pleasant during this time frame, he knew that something was going to happen, and he was getting outside messages from individuals, whether they were human in nature or whether they were otherworldly entities or what have you. There was a person he was working with on a regular basis named Jade Perro. She was receiving what she called to be telepathic communication from otherworldly entities, and they were giving him predictions. And one of those predictions was Robert Kennedy should stay out of airports. Dr. Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated. The Pope is going to be assassinated. Two out of those things happened. The Pope wasn't assassinated, but there was an attempt, but it was stopped. So Keel was getting all this information, and he was also getting information that there was going to be a disaster on the Ohio River. He thought a chemical plant was going to explode. That was depicted in the movie. But it wasn't a chemical plant that exploded. What ultimately happened, obviously, was the Silver Bridge collapse. So he believed he was receiving messages, which is why it's called the Mothman Prophecies, because he was receiving all these messages during this time frame.
That's interesting. So there was a TNT plant out there as well. Is there any connection with that? Because people often bring that up too into it.
Yeah, the TNT plant really, there was a North Power Plant is what it was called, was in the area that's now referred to as the McClintock Wildlife Preserve. And that wildlife preserve was called the TNT area. It's also called the TNT area now, but it's really called the McClintock Wildlife Preserve. That's its name these days. But there was a power plant. Mothman was sighted in the power plant. And the Scarberries and the Millettes were in the TNT area, which was kind of like an area where couples would go to hang out. Kids would drag race their hot rods back in this enclosed foresty type of an area. And the reason it was called the TNT area is because back in World War II, the United States had storage areas for TNT. So there was a munitions plant that was going on there. There was the TNT plant, and then there were 100 domed concrete igloos that they stored these munitions inside of. And then as the underbrush grew over the top of these concrete domes, it was something that couldn't be seen in case there were Japanese or German planes somehow that crossed over into our airspace. So they were kind of protected from that, shielded, so to speak, by the vegetation.
It's wow. So what is the connection in the paranormal though with the TNT? Do they think that, because I've heard so many different theories, such as maybe Mothman was a bird that was somehow radioactive from this TNT plant. I've heard that. I've heard, what else have I heard? There was something else along those lines too, that maybe something from that plant was causing people to see things that weren't there. What is your theories?
Those are both a couple of popular theories. Another thing that I didn't mention was, I think it was the final day that we were in Point Pleasant, the first trip in 2016, We pulled up to Carolyn's Diner, and Mark was inside, and there was a small car, compact car, sitting out front of the restaurant, and on the license plate it said Cornstalk. And so we thought, wow, wonder who might be in there. So we went inside. Mark's half sister is a lady by the name of Lynn Cornwell Robinson, and she is the seventh fire granddaughter of Chief Cornstalk. Now, Chief Cornstalk, as legend has it, was a tribal chieftain of the Cherokee and Mingo tribes back in the 1700s, right around the Revolutionary War time. And he was trying to protect his tribes and his land from colonialism. So we had Fort Randolph, which was right there in what was Virginia at the time, because they hadn't spun off as they did in the Civil War into West Virginia. So the colonialists were staying in the fort, and Cornstalk was trying to stave them off. He didn't want them to take any more lands because they were always pushing westward. Obviously, they pushed all the way to California eventually.
Right.
At that time, he did a wonderful job of holding them off. Now, he was a peacemaker at his heart, and he tried to stop the skirmishes, but there was a skirmish that took place while he was en route to Fort Randolph, and 2 of the settlers were killed. So he didn't know this. He arrived ready to smoke the peace pipe with the settlers, and they took him prisoner, handcuffed him, kept him in stockades, and then one of the people came back in to the camp. There was a lot of heavy drinking that was going on, basically because they'd lost their friends, these 2 people that were killed in the skirmish, and they basically killed Cornstalk and his sons at point blank range. Now, the legend that kind of goes along with the whole Mothman mythos is that in his dying breath, Cornstalk said, "This land shall not prosper for 200 years." And so there is a paranormal element to the legend that perhaps Cornstalk and his curse may have brought the Mothman into existence or summoned it into that area or what have you. And a couple hundred years later, then we have the sightings that kind of kicked off the whole legend back in '66.
As you mentioned earlier, Serpent Mound is pretty close to that as well. Is there any connection in your research with Serpent Mound?
We didn't really drill into Serpent Mound very much. Like I mentioned early on, I was ready to get out of there, not because it's not a cool place and fascinating and all that, and Jackie loved it, but I really wanted to get to Point Pleasant. So there have been other researchers who we're friendly with and that we know who have talked about a potential relationship between Serpent Mound because it's relatively close. It's within 100 miles, I think, of Point Pleasant. So there may be something to that. And again, I mean, so much of our land, the United States of America, was native. Mm-hmm. So I think that really pretty much anywhere within this country where there are tribal burial mounds or remnants of the ancient past with these folks, they knew stuff that we don't know.
Yeah.
They were in the spirit realm in much deeper ways than we are. We're much more materialistic in the way we approach life. So there might very well be a connection like you just mentioned.
Is there a connection between like the Thunderbird and this Mothman?
Well, the Thunderbird was kind of at the top of John Keel's list when he thought that that's what Mothman could be. He also referred to Mothman as the Garuda. Now, the Garuda is like a Hindu/Buddhist similar being to what the Thunderbird is. And for folks who aren't aware, in Native American lore, the Thunderbird pretty much sits at the top of the totem pole between humanity and the gods. So it's like an otherworldly deity type of an entity that has different powers and has different abilities. And Keel really thought that that might very well be the case, and that might very well be what Mothman was a Thunderbird/Garuda.
In your firsthand accounts, I'm sure you researched or you got to talk to a lot of different people around Point Pleasant. What are the people saying that lived through this? What did they actually experience and see if they saw a Mothman?
So of the 11 people that we interviewed for Bridging the Tragedy, 9 of them were really focused on the Silver Bridge disaster. 2 of them had paranormal experiences. Now, that's not to say that the 9 who we talked to primarily about the Silver Bridge disaster weren't weren't fascinated by or went looking for Mothman or what have you, but they didn't actually see Mothman. A couple of them mentioned UFOs. Even Carolyn Harris, who we obviously couldn't interview for the book, when we met her in 2016, she told us about the Men in Black. She told us about the folks that she just knew were government men. They just figured they were government men with the fedora hats and dark glasses and this kind of thing. She said, but there were also a different type of Men in Black that were there. And she said that they didn't act like they were around here. And we kind of read between the lines of what she was talking about. And either she meant they were Eastern European or they were from a different realm. So we didn't really
go too Men in Black or believed to be like UFO aliens or something.
Yeah. She really kind of laid that out there for us. And we didn't go too far in depth with that part of the conversation, but it was fascinating to hear her say this. So the folks that we did interview that had paranormal experiences, one of them is actually a pretty voluminous author when it comes to Mothman. He has several books he's written on Mothman. His name is Andrew Colvin, and he's published hundreds of books in the UFO field, in the Mothman field. He's republished works of John Keel that were collected in Fate magazine and different magazines from back in the day, the beginnings of Forteana and ufology. He's published a lot of the older works, Stranger in the Pentagon, Valiant Thor, things like that. But he was friends with John Keel towards the end of Keel's life. And he also believes that Mothman was a Garuda or a benevolent entity that was really kind of like a cosmic crime fighter, which really fits the paradigm of if Mothman was here in Point Pleasant, maybe Mothman was here to warn us.
Wow. Well, the Men in Black, did they show up in town? I'm always confused on this story. They showed up in town after the bridge collapsed, right?
They were in town before the bridge collapsed and after the bridge collapsed. It sounds like you've read the Mothman Prophecies because Mary Heyer, who was the local stringer for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, and she was there with John Keel doing investigations and interviewing people about UFOs and Mothman. She, at the very beginning of the book, Keel writes about a couple of encounters she had with men that showed up in her office. They almost like just appeared in her office, like she didn't really see them walk in. And they were strange individuals, like 5 feet tall or 4.5 feet tall with really hypnotic eyes hidden behind thick glasses, and asked her all kinds of questions that really seemed kind of stupid. And they asked her about John Keel. Is Keel around? And don't believe him. He's a con man, things like that. So that was after the bridge collapsed. But also before the bridge collapsed, they were in town. And the National Guard actually shut down the TNT area for a time during the whole Mothman flap, would not let people go back there because for months, there were people that were going into the TNT area wanting to go basically see or even hunt Mothman. And Denny Bellamy, he's also in Bridging the Tragedy. He's been on numerous documentaries, and his whole thing was people would ask when they went into the TNT area, if we see it, can we shoot it? And if we see two, can we shoot two? So, I mean, there was all the rage, but eventually government officials came in and they shut down the TNT area, and it was all hush hush.
That's interesting. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the Gateway Podcast with special guest Dr. Bill Kousoulas, author of Bridging the Tragedy. We're exploring the Silver Bridge collapse, post-traumatic growth, and the paranormal connections behind the legend right here on 107.7 FM radio. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this.
Are you ready to explore the unknown? Dive into the world of the strange, mysterious, and unexplained with Eerie Expeditions magazine. Each issue is packed with spine-tingling tales, cutting-edge paranormal investigations, and exclusive insights into hauntings, cryptids, UFOs, and more. Whether you're a seasoned investigator or just love a good ghost story, Eerie Expeditions magazine has something for you. Join our growing community of truth seekers and adventure lovers. Subscribe today at EerieExpeditionsMagazine.com and unlock the secrets of the supernatural. Are you ready? That's EerieExpeditionsMagazine.com, where the extraordinary is just a click away. Dare to discover.
And we're back on the Gateway Podcast here on 107.7 FM. I'm your host, Yael Thomas, and joining me tonight is Dr. Bill Kousoulas. He's the author of Bridging the Tragedy. You can find his book. It's on Amazon.com, and it's also on his website, I saw. Bill, what's your website?
You know, I actually have typed in our website and our email and my Facebook into the chat. Would you like me to send that to you?
Yes, and you know what? I'll post that after the show on Facebook, right underneath the show. So if you're listening tonight and you're looking for that website, it will be posted on my Facebook. Before the break, we were diving into the Silver Bridge collapse and kind of its lasting impact. Did you uncovered the personal stories from survivors and witnesses? What surprised you or shifted your perspective on this entire event?
I can tell you, as somebody who's been interested in the paranormal since I was about 9 years old, that working on bridging the tragedy and getting close to these people that went through, to me, a nostalgic, legendary event in time, meeting them, researching, analyzing the data, hearing the human stories, I became less interested in the paranormal aspect of things and more interested in the human stories. That was the biggest surprise that I found. As somebody who's always aspired to be a published author up until this point, and we continue to work, Jackie and I do, in this area, it's the human stories that are more important to us than anything else is. So I think that was the first observation that I made. For me, it was a paradigm shift because I was really interested in the paranormal stuff. But then to hear the story about the Silver Bridge disaster from really the mouths of firsthand experiencers, people who lost friends, people who lost family. One gentleman lost both his mom and dad. I mean, just to go through all that, I know when we placed our ad in the Point Pleasant Register, which interestingly enough is the same newspaper that Mary Heyer wrote for when she was alive and there at the Mothman, the nexus of the whole Mothman legend, that we had Jimmy Wedge come forth. He called me on my cell phone and he said, "Yeah, I'd like to talk to y'all." So I'd really like to talk to you. I haven't given an interview. He said, "I did one in Cleveland back probably 40 years ago, and I haven't given them since then." He said, "But I'd like to tell my story. I'd like to talk to you." And I was immediately humbled. And it put me in a position of really reverence for him, much like with Carolyn. Here's a guy who lost his mom and dad. And am I worthy to hear this story? I mean, I really thought that. And so we conducted a few interviews on our first trip to Point Pleasant. We interviewed Mark Griffith, the guy we met with Carolyn. We interviewed a guy by the name of Rick Handley. We interviewed Denny Bellamy, who I mentioned. We interviewed Linda Lane and Susan Sayer. And we kept mentioning to the folks that we were going to interview this guy named Jimmy Wedge. And Rick and Denny both kind of looked at us and they're like, "Who? He doesn't give interviews. You're not going to talk to Jimmy Wedge." And then we had lunch with Jeff Wamsley from the Mothman Museum, and Jeff was the last interview that we did. And before we interviewed Jimmy, Jeff was several months later. Jeff looked at us the same way. He's like, "He doesn't give interviews. You're going to interview Jimmy Wedge?" And so by then we were all worked up. I mean, in the first place, I was already nervous because here I'm going to interview this guy that lost his mom and dad. And I'm a newly minted psychologist, and my wife is a retired postmaster. She literally retired right before that road trip to go interview people. And so we're like, "Well, should I interview him? I'm a psychologist." "Well, maybe you should. You're a government official." He was a legislator. He was actually the mayor of Point Pleasant after the bridge collapsed many years later. And then he was in the Congress, I think in the Congress or the Senate of the state of West Virginia. And he's a lobbyist now. And he was almost 80 years old when we met him. So we were all nervous to go talk to Jimmy, and we sat down with him, and he immediately put us at ease. He was the funniest guy that we interviewed for the whole story. He had us in stitches. And yes, he had a very poignant and sad story, but he illustrated all these different aspects of post-traumatic growth. He was the oldest person that we interviewed, and he was actually 25 when the bridge went down. And so he was an adult. Everybody else was significantly younger than he was, 18 at the closest. But he was amazing. But that was one of the things that was a real paradigm shifter for me too. And I was really kind of intimidated to interview this guy and worried about him. And he just made me laugh like nobody else.
I put your website down in the scroll. So it's prpconnect.org for those who want to check out his book. So go there, purchase his book. So here's the community. What makes it so interesting is you have this big tragedy event that happened, right? But before that, you have the Men in Black, like you said earlier, they're continuing to go around town collecting these stories about Mothman. It just changes the dynamic so much. So people were already fearful of the Men in Black walking around and all this phenomenon going on with the Mothman. But then you have this tragedy on top of that. So how do you move forward from that? How did the town kind of pick itself back up and start the healing process?
It took a long time. It took a really long time. And one of the saddest chapters, I think, in the Mothman / Silver Bridge story is that when the bridge collapsed, it took 2 years to build the new bridge. And what we haven't talked about is how this Silver Bridge was really the conduit, not just between the East and the West going over the Ohio River, but really between the North and the South. I mean, a lot of the folks who actually died in the Silver Bridge disaster were truck drivers from North Carolina or from Detroit or from, all over the place. And so this bridge went down, and this town that had been thriving before this Mothman thing happened, and certainly before the bridge collapsed, came to a standstill for 2 years. Now, they finally, Lyndon B. Johnson said, we'll have a new bridge put together in 2 years. We'll have it done. They did that, but they didn't build the bridge in the same place. What they decided to do is to build it about a mile or two to the south. And so what ended up happening as a result of that, all the traffic that used to go right through downtown Point Pleasant, people traveling, stopping in town to get gas, to have meals, to do shopping, that all stopped. I mean, to get from one side of the river to the other side of the river, you had to take a ferry for 2 years, or you had to drive many, many miles down to Huntington, or many, many miles the other direction up to Pomeroy. And so there were 46 miles in between those two things, which is really interesting. 46 miles between those two other bridges, and 46 people died in the Silver Bridge disaster. That's another thing that we found in our research, is that a lot of numerical coincidences seem to take place as well. But I may have kind of veered off a little bit. What was your original question?
How does the community start to pick itself up when you have the fear from the paranormal going on, and then you have the tragedy on top of that?
So sadly, and thank you for bringing me back to that. Sadly, what ended up happening was all of this traffic that went downtown Point Pleasant no longer went downtown Point Pleasant. And people did shop in Gallipolis, Ohio, on the other side of the river, thrived. They have strip malls, they have businesses, they have restaurants, they have all kinds of stuff. They have accommodations, hotels and such. We usually stay in Gallipolis when we go to the Mothman Festival, or when we go back to the Point Pleasant area, because they have more accommodations there. But really from 1967, when the bridge collapsed, until 2002, when the Mothman Prophecies movie was released, Point Pleasant was dying. I mean, they were closing stores. And one of the things, like when we interviewed Susan Sayer, she talked about how sad it was that all these different stores that she grew up shopping at, they just went away. And so when the movie was released, Jeff Wamsley and Carolyn Harris got together, and they wanted to figure out a way to maybe capitalize, in Jeff's words, capitalize a little bit on the Mothman movie. And so they held the first Mothman Festival. And the first Mothman Festival, as people have told us, was basically a couple card tables where Carolyn was selling hamburgers and Jeff was selling his books.
When was that? How long has that been going on?
It was in 2002. It was later on the same year that the movie was released. So That was the first festival, and it's just kind of taken off since then. And so the festival was already a big deal, 14 years later when Jackie and I arrived in town. And I'm not like a big festival guy. I'm kind of more of an introvert. My wife is more of an extrovert. She loves festivals and big gatherings and talking to people all day long. And I'd rather be on my computer, or reading a book or writing something. So I never would have gone to the Mothman Festival had we not worked on our book. And now we go to the Mothman Festival. We've been to the last 6 Mothman festivals, even though 2 of them were canceled because of COVID. We were there during what would have been the festival. But long story short, the community just began to thrive. And even since 2016, now here we are 9 years later, and we've been to Point Pleasant every time, at least once a year. There is a marked difference in what it was like in 2016 to what it's like in 2025. I can tell you the year that we debuted Bridging the Tragedy, which was in 2022, they had not had the festival for 2 years. We went there and there were a bunch of other diehards that were hanging out there, but there was no real festival. In 2022, they had about 30,000 people in that little town. And the way Denny Bellamy describes it is Mothman weekend is kind of like this. You invite all your relatives to come home, everybody in town does it, and they all come at the same time. So all these people just descend upon Point Pleasant. That was the most populated Mothman festival that I've been to, and there were none as big as that in the past. It's kind of slowed down a little bit since then, but I want to say the last 3 years that we've been there, it's also been in the 20s. So there'll be a ton of people there. The town is flourishing now, but to answer your question specifically with what we found in Bridging the Tragedy was we looked at the interviews of all the people who had gone through the bridge disaster, and we found all kinds of different things that they have gained as a result of going through this tragedy and losing family members and such. But there was resilience, there's spiritual development, there's sense of community, there's entrepreneurialism. In addition to the Mothman Museum, there are all kinds of businesses that are springing up right there on Main Street in Point Pleasant now. People aren't leaving. Kids would leave when they graduated high school to go away. They're staying in town and they're opening up businesses now. So the way that when we interviewed Susan, what she talked about was, we talk about how Mothman came to town and kind of saved the town. Because after the bridge went down, it took a few years till the movie came out, but now the community is thriving again.
Now yourself you're a qualitative researcher. How do you bring scientific method to topics like spirituality and the unexplained?
So there's 3 different ways to do doctoral research. There's the quantitative method, which is through statistics. There's the qualitative method, which is through personal interviews. And then there's mixed methods, which is a combination of both. I'm not a stats guy, so I've done all my research on the experiential end of things. So the way that we analyze the data and we go about collecting the data is all based upon the personal interview. It's sitting down and asking guided, open-ended questions like, what was your life like before the Silver Bridge collapsed? And then they would start talking a little bit. And then we would just kind of throw more things in, not necessarily looking for anything in particular, but really wanting to hear their stories, but lining up, a sequence of questions that are designed to open the conversation up to get that data. Once we have the interviews recorded, we usually use multiple sources, video, audio, et cetera, because something always fails. We will transcribe the interviews. Once the interviews are transcribed, we send them back to the participants. We ask them if they want to change anything. We ask them if they want to add or redact, because the last thing we want to do is have somebody who's trusted us and talked to us have a second thought and say, you know what, I talked about, Frank, and I don't want to talk about Frank. We need to redact what we talked to Frank about. So we have them pull, aspects that are related to Frank or what have you. So once we've collected all that information and we've done the member checking, which is having them kind of verify that what we have is what they wanted to say, we take all the interviews and we upload them into a software. Now, the software that I use is called Atlas TI. And what it allows me to do is to take and compare all the different interviews and look at each one of the lines of all the things that people said. And we do a process called coding. So I'll take a look at the lines that each person has said. I'll attach a meaning unit to that. And so just to give you an idea, in Bridging the Tragedy, in the 11 interviews that we had almost 2,300 meaning units. Once we get those meaning units together, we put them into categories. And that's called focus coding. The first step is initial coding. The second step is focus coding. So we take all those things. It's kind of, if you imagine a big funnel, you're narrowing your focus down to be able to find out what you're really looking for. For us, we were looking for the elements of post-traumatic growth for people who had been through the Silver Bridge disaster and or the paranormal phenomena associated with Mothman, Men in Black, UFOs, et cetera, et cetera. We go from the initial coding down to the categories, which is the focus coding, then down into what's known as theoretical coding. And from there, we develop the dimensions of post-traumatic growth. So it's kind of a big funneling process. It's really arduous. It takes a lot of work. We're working on our next book right now. I'm about 3,000 codes into that one, and we still have 4 interviews to go. So
Is that with the same area?
it's the next book is we already have a working title for it, and that's called Transcending the Darkness. And what we're looking for here, it's not specific to Point Pleasant or Mothman, but it's looking at the relationships between trauma in people's lives and the manifestation of paranormal activity in people's lives. Because I've always believed that there is a relationship. I believe that people who have experienced trauma are more open to extreme possibilities, but I don't know if that's a reciprocal relationship or if it's coincidental, using that word again, or if one affects the other first, like the chicken and the egg, or maybe the other affects the other one first. We don't know that. But again, we're focusing on post-traumatic growth too. So it's the relationship between trauma and paranormal activity, but what good came of your life as a result of going through that trauma and that paranormal activity. That's the next book.
That's really interesting. I talked to a lot of mediums over the years, and that's the one thing they always claim, that after they had someone significant in their life either pass away or get sick or something happened, it somehow becomes a spiritual awakening for them, and then they're open to these paranormal abilities, which is...
I talked to researcher Grant Cameron about a year ago, and we were discussing, my theory that I think trauma and paranormal activity certainly go together. And he had said that anything that can shut down the left brain and allow the right brain to kind of connect to whatever it connects to, hello kitty cat, is something that definitely opens up those extreme possibilities. And trauma is one of them, down the left brain. So that was something that he certainly corroborated and thought that was definitely a thing. And we found it. You mentioned mediums. We interviewed a lady by the name of Gail Hyson. I don't know if you know Gail or not. She's also a Californiite. She's transplanted from, I think, Brooklyn or Long Island. And she went through significant trauma. And she has a podcast called The Small Medium at Large. And she is so psychically connected. She is unbelievable. She's just amazing.
I'll have to look her up. I'll definitely have to look her up. In all your research and findings around Point Pleasant, is there any paranormal activity still happening there, or is that just done?
There are reports that there's still paranormal activity that's going on. There are people who have had sightings. There are people who have had weird things happen. Jackie and I occasionally get together and do ghost box sessions or Estes sessions. And so we've been able to kind of discern some strange things in the Point Pleasant area. We did a ghost box session at a dance studio in the area. We got all kinds of crazy information. And then we did a couple of different sessions in Charleston, West Virginia, which is where Andy Colvin, who I mentioned earlier, and his friend Harriet had some early childhood experiences with paranormal activity. And I got to tell you, the ghost box sessions we had there, we actually have them on our YouTube channel. They are out of sight. They're just crazy. So I do think there's something special going on in the Ohio River Valley when it comes to paranormal activity.
Charleston, West Virginia, is that where Charles Manson was born? Do you know?
You're the first person that I have talked to who actually was aware that Charles Manson was connected to Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Sarah Jane Moore, also the woman who attempted to assassinate President Ford back in the 70s. They were friends. They grew up on the same block, basically, that Andy and Harriet grew up on. And they were known to be seen hand in hand walking through the community. Now, interestingly enough, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but the first ghost box session that we did on Bird Mountain, which is right where they all lived, we got some of the craziest hits that we've ever had. We had the sensation of like electrical sensation around the third eye crown chakra area, being pulled up by that area. And then we went back 2 years later and did another one in the same region and had those kinds of things happen too. And that's probably a topic for another show. We can go on.
That's a whole different show.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Really
But yeah,
fascinating.
was from right there, right where we were.
You know, stories of Mothman go all the way up to Western PA as well. I used to hear when I was a kid, don't go in the woods at night, Mothman might get you. I
Sure.
used to hear that as a kid. But
Yeah.
what do you have, like for listeners that are intrigued with your work, what's your next research project aside from your book? Do you have anything else coming up?
Well, outside of Bridging the Tragedy, it would be the next book, which is Transcending the Darkness. We were hoping to have that one ready to debut at next weekend's Mothman Festival, but we just couldn't get rolling on it quickly enough. So really, I mean, that's what we do for the most part, is we research and then write books about these types of topics. So those are the only two projects that we presently have, the first book and then the second one we're working on now.
Gotcha. And where are you going to be at this festival? Do you have a table there? Can people come see you?
We do. Actually, we're going to be presenting at the Trinity Lutheran Church, or Trinity Methodist Church, I think it is. We'll be presenting at 5 o'clock on this next Saturday, so 10 days from now or thereabouts. We'll be presenting then, but we also have a table. We'll be right next to our friends Joey and Tanya Medea, who will be there. Ken Gerhard is also going to be one of the speakers. Richard Haddam, who is the screenwriter for the Mothman Prophecies movie, is going to be there also. They've got a good panel of people speaking. And the night before the Mothman Festival, Jackie and I will be talking about Bridging the Tragedy at the Gallipolis or Samuel L. Bossard Memorial Library. So we'll be talking about our book there. And we're going to probably have a couple people who participated in Bridging the Tragedy there as like panel people to discuss what they experienced as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed having you on.
Well, thank you, Seal. It's been nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on.
Don't go away, because I have something to ask you real quick. Okay, so don't go just yet.
I'll stay right here.
Okay. So you've been listening to the Gateway Podcast, broadcast from 107.7 FM New Orleans. My guest tonight, Dr. Bill Kousoulas, author of Bridging the Tragedy, Exploring the Silver Bridge Collapse, Post-Traumatic Growth, and the Paranormal Connections Tied to the Legend of Mothman. If you missed any part of the show, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel to catch and replay and stay up to date on all my latest radio interviews. And pretty soon I have some little short documentaries that are about to come out on YouTube as well. You can find a link through my website at clthomas.org. And Bill's website, you can find his website and read about what he's doing and follow him. It's prpconnect.org. Thank you all for listening, and until next time.